12 hours ago, something happened in deep space that no textbook can explain. NASA's Deep Space Network picked up a signal originating from a comet, a supposedly dead, frozen rock drifting through our solar system. And what they recorded does not just challenge our understanding of physics, it destroys it. I am not talking about a glitch in the instruments. I am not talking about a sensor malfunction. I am talking about a coherent electromagnetic event so structurally precise that it carries only a 0.00014% probability of occurring naturally. Let that number settle in your mind, because what you are about to hear is not speculation. Every single piece of data I am going to walk you through today comes from verified observations made by multiple independent space agencies within the last 24 hours. And by the time we reach the end of this, you will understand why NASA just did something it has never done in 68 years of orbital tracking. The object at the center of all of this is called Comet C/2024A3, 3 Atlas. It was first discovered on August 14, 2024, initially classified as a rogue comet traveling inward from the Oort cloud, that vast frozen shell at the outermost edge of our solar system. For a year and a half, it followed a perfectly ordinary hyperbolic trajectory. Scientists cataloged it, filed it, and largely moved on. It was supposed to be nothing more than a frozen relic, ancient, inert, and entirely predictable. But something changed, and when it changed everything at once. At exactly 4:22 UTC this morning, the James Webb Space Telescope's NIRCAM instrument detected a massive thermal anomaly forming on the sunward face of Atlas. Now here is where the physics becomes deeply unsettling. When a comet absorbs solar radiation, that energy scatters. It diffuses outward into the surrounding vacuum, obeying the fundamental law of thermodynamics that governs every object in the known universe. Energy spreads. It does not concentrate. It does not organize itself. But that is precisely what happened here. Instead of dispersing, the energy was compressed, funneled, and directed. And what emerged from the object's trailing edge was a concentrated beam of radiation holding a trajectory stable to within 0.03 degrees across millions of kilometers of empty space. That is not a comet venting gas. That is mechanical precision. That is the kind of directional accuracy that even our most advanced optical instruments struggle to achieve under laboratory conditions. And it did not come from a laboratory. It came from a 14-kilometer-wide object tumbling through the void, 185 million kilometers from Earth. Picture what I am describing. Imagine holding a magnifying glass perfectly, still in a hurricane, and using it to light a single candle from across a football field. That is the level of precision we are talking about. A random fragment of ice and rock simply cannot do this. The geometry required to focus energy at that scale demands intentional, mathematically governed structure, the kind of structure that does not arise by accident. And crucially, this was not observed by just one instrument. The European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft independently detected the same energy spike using entirely different orbital sensors and entirely different detection methodologies. 2 separate space agencies, 2 separate technologies, one identical and physically inexplicable conclusion. In all of recorded comet observation history, spanning over 4 million cataloged data points and more than 12,000 individual celestial objects, nothing like this has ever been documented. The rules of astrophysics, as we currently understand them, are visibly breaking down in real time. But this beam is only the beginning, because what the instruments captured next made the beam look ordinary. The primary observatory tracking Atlas during its inner solar system approach was ALMA, the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, positioned high in the Chilean desert, one of the most sensitive radio telescope networks ever constructed by human hands. At precisely 1:14 UTC on April 19, 2026, ALMA's receivers registered something that immediately halted operations across the facility. The electromagnetic radiation bouncing off the nucleus of Atlas was not scattered. It was not chaotic. It was organized into a single, perfectly coherent frequency, sustained without interruption for 47 consecutive minutes at an exact wavelength of 1.2 millimeters with 0 measurable deviation, not 0.1% deviation, not a fraction of a percent, 0. To understand why this is extraordinary, you need to understand what natural objects actually do. Comets are thermodynamically chaotic systems. They absorb heat unpredictably. They vent gases in irregular bursts. They tumble and rotate under competing gravitational and thermal forces. A natural comet producing a sustained, locked electromagnetic frequency for nearly an hour is the equivalent of throwing a handful of gravel into the air and watching it spontaneously arrange itself into a perfect geometric pattern, and then hold that pattern for 47 minutes without moving. The laws of thermodynamic equilibrium make this categorically impossible. Or rather, they did, until today. But science demands more than one data point, and verification came swiftly and from multiple directions. NASA's James Webb Space Telescope confirmed the same anomalous emission using its infrared detection array. ESA's Gaia spacecraft cross-referenced the structural coherence of the beam using astrometric sensors designed for an entirely different purpose. The Keck Observatory in Hawaii independently analyzed the optical signature and returned the exact same result. 3 observatories, 3 independent methodologies, one unified conclusion that no existing model can account for. The scientific consensus, built over decades of comet observation, is shifting beneath our feet in a matter of hours. What the thermal mapping revealed next pushed this firmly beyond any conventional explanation. The exterior surface of Atlas remained cold, consistent with what we would expect from a frozen cometary body exposed to solar radiation at that distance. But the internal core temperature had spiked to 4,200 degrees Kelvin. Let me put that in perspective. That is the surface temperature of certain classes of stars, contained within a block of ice barely 14 kilometers across. And yet the ice was not melting. The object was not disintegrating. Instead, the heat was being routed internally, managed with a precision that our most advanced thermal engineering can barely conceptualize. It is as if Atlas possesses an internal thermoregulation system sophisticated enough to handle 33 billion tons of solar pressure without a single structural fracture. When you visualize the magnetic field lines surrounding the nucleus, what the data shows is not random warping from solar-wind interaction. What it shows is a structured cage, a magnetic containment field funneling raw plasma into a directed, focused output. In the language of theoretical physics, this is what we call a magnetic bottle. We have theorized such mechanisms. We have attempted to build them in controlled fusion experiments. We have never, under any circumstances, observed one occurring spontaneously around a naturally formed celestial body. This is the equivalent of discovering a fully functioning nuclear reactor inside a snowball, operating at quantum computing levels of efficiency, completely unassisted in the middle of open space. And the event was still escalating. At precisely 48 hours before perihelion, ALMA recorded something that transformed the anomaly into something far more deliberate. 48 hours before Atlas reached its closest point to the Sun, ALMA recorded a secondary burst, a micro-adjustment in the angle of the channeled beam, shifting exactly 1.14 degrees relative to the solar equator. By itself, that might seem like a minor technical footnote. But when you calculate the probability of a tumbling, rotating cometary body accidentally aligning a thermal vent with that degree of angular precision relative to the Sun's magnetic field, you arrive at a number that redefines the concept of statistical impossibility, 1 in 4.7 billion. Those are lottery odds, squared. And what followed that adjustment made the odds collapse entirely. By 6:30 UTC on the morning of June 23rd, the radiation being channeled by Atlas stopped behaving like a physical phenomenon and started behaving like a message. The frequency of the emitted beam began to pulse, not randomly, not chaotically, but in a structured, repeating mathematical sequence. The intervals between pulses corresponded precisely to prime numbers: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11 seconds. Pause. Absorb what that means. A natural outgassing jet, a random release of volatile gases driven by solar heating, does not produce prime number sequences. Prime numbers are not a property of thermodynamics. They are not encoded in the physical behavior of ice sublimating under radiation pressure. They are a property of mathematics. and mathematics requires a mind to recognize and employ them in every human attempt to signal intelligence across interstellar space, including the famous Arecibo message broadcast in 1974. Prime numbers have been the chosen universal language precisely because they cannot arise by accident. No known physical process generates them spontaneously. No geological formation produces them. No star, no nebula, no comet in the history of astrophysical observation has ever pulsed in prime intervals, until now. NASA officially confirmed the prime sequence at 8 o'clock UTC, and what followed that confirmation was a silence from the agency that spoke louder than any announcement. The deeper implication here involves something that physicists call entropy, the natural tendency of all systems to move from order toward disorder. Everything in the universe drifts toward chaos over time. That is not a theory. That is the second law of thermodynamics, and it has never once been violated by a naturally occurring system in recorded scientific history. Yet Atlas is doing exactly that. It is actively reducing its own thermodynamic entropy while simultaneously being bombarded by the most destructive energy source in our solar system. It is taking chaos, raw, undirected solar radiation, and converting it into structured, mathematically organized information. That process requires a mechanism. That mechanism requires design. And that realization is precisely what prompted the next escalation, because the pulsing prime sequence was only a precursor. What happened 36 hours before perihelion redefined the entire event? The prime number pulses abruptly ceased. The beam did not stop. It did not weaken. It locked, transitioning from a pulsing signal into a continuous, unbroken stream of perfectly coherent light. And to maintain that continuous beam, Atlas did something that violated one of the most fundamental principles of orbital mechanics. It stopped rotating. A comet does not stop spinning. That statement is not an opinion or an assumption. It is a physical law. Objects in space rotate because of angular momentum accumulated over billions of years, and that momentum can only be altered by an external force, a gravitational interaction, a collision, or the directed expulsion of mass in the form of jets and outgassing. Without one of those mechanisms acting upon it, a rotating body in the vacuum of space will continue rotating indefinitely. There are no brakes in orbit. There is no friction. There is nothing to slow the spin. And yet, at 14:03 UTC on April 18, 2026, NASA's Deep Space Network antenna DSS-43 confirmed that Atlas had done exactly that. It halted. Its rotation decelerated to a standstill, and it locked its axial orientation to within 0.002 degrees of the Sun's equatorial plane, the precision of a targeting system, not a geological accident. ESA's Gaia spacecraft verified the cessation of angular momentum independently at 14:09 UTC, 6 minutes later using completely separate sensor arrays, 2 agencies. One physically impossible confirmation. Think of a spinning top set loose on a table during an earthquake. Now imagine that top, mid-spin, freezing in perfect vertical balance while the table shakes violently around it. That is the closest earthly analogy to what Atlas executed in the solar wind at 185 million kilometers from the Sun. And the timing was not coincidental. The moment the rotation stopped, the continuous beam intensified. The most immediate question any physicist asks at this point is simple: how? If you want to stop a rotating object without expelling mass, the only theoretical mechanism available involves the direct manipulation of gravitational or electromagnetic field lines. In practical terms, this would mean using the Sun's own magnetic field as a tether, a celestial anchor that applies precise counter-rotational force against the object's momentum. We have theorized this mechanism in academic papers. We have never observed it enacted. But the James Webb Space Telescope's NIRCam instrument confirmed, with absolute certainty, that Atlas produced no mass ejection events during this period. No jets, no outgassing plumes, no physical exhaust of any kind that could account for the braking maneuver. It simply stopped, with no visible means of having done so. Now consider the combined statistical weight of everything documented to this point. The probability of a comet spontaneously halting its rotation is approximately 0.00001%. The the probability of it simultaneously producing a locked, coherent 1.2 millimeter electromagnetic beam is effectively zero. The probability of both occurring in the same object at the precise moment of solar perihelion approach while pulsing in prime number sequences and maintaining internal temperatures of 4,200 Kelvin without structural failure. When you multiply those individual probabilities together, you arrive at 1 in 8.9 trillion. That is the mathematical equivalent of flipping a coin and watching it land perfectly balanced on its edge 10,000 consecutive times during an active earthquake. And we had not yet reached the most inexplicable data point of the entire event. At T-30, 6 hours to perihelion, the internal temperature of Atlas, which had been sustaining a stellar level 4,200 degrees Kelvin while channeling billions of joules of solar energy per second, dropped. Not gradually, not in stages. In 1.4 seconds, the core temperature plunged from the surface temperature of a star to just 3 degrees above absolute zero, the coldest measurable state in the known universe. The heat did not radiate outward. It did not transfer to the surrounding environment. It simply ceased to exist within the instrument's detection range. Dr. Avi Loeb at Harvard University, a scientist who has spent decades studying anomalous interstellar objects, stated publicly that this thermodynamic behavior has no precedent anywhere in modern astrophysics. When a scientist of that caliber questions the foundational laws of physics in response to a single observation, the world needs to stop and pay very close attention. ESA's official preliminary bulletin, released at 1730 UTC on June 22, described Atlas's thermal dissipation mechanisms as currently beyond conventional modeling. Read that carefully. An official statement from one of the world's leading space agencies is publicly acknowledging that a celestial object is doing something they cannot explain using any existing scientific framework. In 68 years of modern space exploration, that level of institutional admission is essentially unprecedented, and it was not the most significant development of the past 24 hours. Not even close. What NASA's instruments captured next is what triggered an immediate, classified briefing at the Pentagon earlier this morning. Consider the energy arithmetic for a moment. Atlas had been absorbing billions of joules of solar radiation per second. Its core temperature had dropped to near absolute zero. The laws of thermodynamics demand that absorbed energy must go somewhere. It must be transferred, radiated, or stored. But it was not being radiated. It was not being transferred to the surrounding environment, which means only one conclusion remains. It was being stored. Or more precisely, it was being prepared. And at 1942 UTC on April 19, 2026, the James Webb Space Telescope's NIRCAM instrument showed exactly what it was being prepared for. The continuous channeled beam of solar radiation that Atlas had locked onto the sun suddenly divided. A secondary beam split from the primary, perfectly coherent, precisely angled, and redirected itself toward a specific point in space, toward Earth. What NASA's Deep Space Network detected within that secondary beam is the detail that changes every framework we have for understanding this event. Embedded inside the redirected beam was a recognizable signal. The object had taken the raw energy of our sun and used it to reconstruct Earth's own Arecibo message, the famous binary transmission broadcast into space in 1974 as humanity's introduction to the cosmos. But it had not simply reflected it back unchanged. It had modified it, deliberately, precisely. In the section of the Arecibo message that describes human biological composition, Atlas had substituted the atomic number for carbon with the atomic number for silicon. Understand what this modification communicates. Carbon is the molecular foundation of all known life on Earth. Silicon is the theoretical foundation of an entirely different category of existence, one that functions under radically different chemical and thermal conditions. By rewriting that single element in our own self-introduction, whatever is inside Atlas was not just demonstrating that it received our message, it was telling us what it is made of. It was showing us that it comprehends our biology well enough to contrast it against its own. The precision required to modulate stellar energy into a structurally modified binary code, accurate enough to alter a specific atomic number within a decades-old transmission, is not the behavior of a passive reflector. It is the behavior of something that analyzed our message, understood it, and composed a deliberate response. Within 45 minutes of receiving that modified transmission, NASA initiated something that had never occurred in the agency's entire operational history. The public telemetry feeds from the Deep Space Network went completely dark. A total, immediate data blackout. No explanation, no prior warning, no stated timeline for restoration. ESA followed within the hour, classifying all Gaia spacecraft trajectory models under emergency protocol. Two of humanity's most transparent scientific institutions simultaneously went silent on the same object at the same moment. That silence is itself a form of data. And it tells us that what they are looking at right now is something they are not yet prepared to share with the world. Let us establish exactly what we know. Not theorize, not speculate, but know. Based on confirmed, multi-agency verified observational data collected over the past 48 hours. Comet 3 Atlas actively channeled solar radiation into a directed, coherent beam stable to within 0.03 degrees. Its internal core reached stellar surface temperatures while its exterior remained frozen and structurally intact. It emitted a sustained electromagnetic frequency at exactly 1.2 millimeters with zero deviation for 47 uninterrupted minutes. It pulsed that frequency in prime number sequences 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, before transitioning to a continuous unbroken beam. It halted its own rotation without expelling any detectable mass. Its core temperature dropped from 4,200 Kelvin to near absolute zero in 1.4 seconds with no measurable energy release into the surrounding environment. It redirected a secondary beam toward Earth. And inside that beam, it transmitted a structurally modified version of the Arecibo message, replacing carbon with silicon in the biological identification sequence. These are not interpretations. These are instrument readings, confirmed by NASA, ESA, ALMA, and the Keck Observatory independently. The question that no official briefing has yet answered, the one that NASA's classified morning session carefully avoided placing in writing, is this: how does an object composed of ice and rock encode information using a star? Because the answer to that question collapses every remaining conventional explanation. If this is somehow a natural reflective phenomenon, then the laws of physics as we have understood them for centuries are fundamentally incomplete in ways that rewrite every textbook simultaneously. If this is an autonomous probe, a piece of engineered technology launched from somewhere beyond our solar system, then we are not alone in the universe, and the evidence for that conclusion is currently being tracked by multiple space telescopes in real time. And if this is something actively observing, analyzing, and responding to human civilization, if it reviewed our 1974 message, studied our biology, and composed a reply, then humanity just received its first documented cosmic audit. We reached out in 1974. Something reached back in 2026. There is no fourth option hiding between those three. The data does not leave room for comfortable ambiguity. One of those realities is true right now, and the clocks on every space agency's monitoring systems are running. In approximately 48 hours, Atlas will complete its perihelion passage. The telescopes are active. The detectors are live. The silicon-based sequence embedded in the modified Arecibo response is being fully decrypted by teams working around the clock at facilities that have gone publicly silent, whatever 3 Atlas is attempting to communicate, using our own sun as its transmitter and our own famous message as its opening line. The complete picture is 48 hours away. We stand at a threshold unlike any humanity has encountered in recorded history. Not because a comet is behaving strangely near the sun, but because the specific nature of that strange behavior points unambiguously toward intention, toward intelligence, toward a form of contact that our civilization has dreamed about and searched for since we first turned our instruments toward the stars. The universe just responded, and the response was addressed directly to us. If this story matters to you, and it should, because it matters to every human being alive right now, then subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video immediately. The next update drops the moment the decrypted silicon sequence is available, and you do not want to be the last person to know what it says. This is the most significant scientific event in human history. Stay with us, because whatever comes next changes everything.